Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that you can hear me. Right now, I can just see TJ. So if you can, I see a few attendees in there. So if someone could put in the chat that you can hear us, just so we know we're a go. Thank you, Aubrey. Excellent. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Because there's two presenters, we just had to make sure we could each log in both. So we're ready to get started. We're really excited to get going here. TJ, why don't you just take a minute and introduce us, the Schoolhouse 302, and the principal seminar, and I'll begin sharing my screen.
Sure thing, Joe. So we are the Schoolhouse 302, and we do professional development, typically in the United States and now across Canada as well, for school districts and schools. We've been established since 2017, and we are a Leadership Development Institute. Joe and I are both practitioners. I'm an assistant superintendent in a district with about 12,000 students, comprehensive, and Joe is a superintendent in a school district that's vocational, and they serve 4 vocational high schools. And we also work with a group, Matt Foster and Aubrey Patterson, with the principal seminar, and we just ran our first master class in Candid and Compassionate Feedback, which is a book that Joe and I wrote. And that class runs 5 times 1 hour each. And tonight you're going to get a preview of the book's content and learn about effective feedback practices. And we hope to engage you with that. And without further ado, Joe, do you want to get started?
All right.
There you go.
All right, perfect. So now you should be able to see my screen, and we're going to get going. As TJ said, you know, this book was originally born from the idea that we know there's a few ways that we can improve. And once you master some of the key elements of what good instruction is, what good management is, you have a strategic plan. Well, that's the visioning. Then there's the alignment. And then ultimately, none of that matters until we have good execution. And it's the execution in which feedback is critical, and making sure that we're living out that vision and mission. So what we know in our world is that, you know, we have to be candid. And there's a clear definition of what that is. That is direct, effective communication anchored towards the vision, goals, and mission of the organization. And it is supposed to be under the umbrella of compassion. It's not rude, it's not curt. Those are sometimes misguided or misleading thoughts around candor and compassion. But we also know that in our world, most of us have walked in to this profession because we want to help people. We want to help students. If we find ourselves in the ranks of administration, we want to help teachers. I can tell you as a superintendent, I see my role as one of pure opportunity. One of, excuse me, one of opportunity, and provide that for others. But knowing that, and knowing many of us, even in this session, are altruistic, we find ourselves living in what we call the circle of nice. TJ, would you mind sharing a little bit about what that is, this circle of nice?
Sure thing. So in the book, what we talk about is a culture of nice in schools. And we say that culture of nice traps you in what we call the circle of nice. And inside that circle, things are very comfortable. People are very kind to one another, but not necessarily effective. And so we, like Joe said, we tend to set a vision. We have a strategic plan. We may even have a way to move in and out of classrooms, or have PLC conversations, professional learning communities, or even a leadership team. But if we're not using Candor as a tool, and we're kind of doing what we're going to call the Candor cancellations that we'll talk about here in a minute, we end up being trapped in a culture of nice where everybody's comfortable, but we're not effective. And so we want to get out of that into what we call a space of integrity. And in that space of integrity is where we're challenging one another, we're working together, we're working hard to be effective, and we're finding that effective trumps comfort, and then we move into a place where collective and self-efficacy can be built. There are some assumptions, though, that school leaders make around NICE and around Candor, and we want to introduce one of those assumptions today, which is the fact that being nice, or the assumption that being nice leads to relationships that will help you lead better. And one of our Candor cancellations, and some of them are a bit funny, is the ease or inner. And we attribute this, whether you're new to your position, or whether you're new to a conversation, or whether you're, even new to a person who you're supervising, is that we want to ease in, be nice. We've all heard it when you get a new job. Everybody says, build relationships first. And while that may sound good, it's not built on the premise of effectiveness and directness. And what we turn to in our research, Covey's 13 high trust behaviors around being direct, confronting reality, actually doing that work and being candid and being real with people is what builds trust and what builds relationships. When we hold back and don't say what we think, we actually diminish trust and relationships. So that's our first assumption. It's better to lead with candor and build a relationship from there than to try to ease in and quote unquote build the relationship and then say something that you needed to say. Joe?
I'm just going to go through a little bit of the Candor cancellations. Essentially, these are archetypes that prevent growth-oriented feedback. And you may find yourself embracing, each one of these on some level. And just to reiterate what TJ was saying about the assumptions, unfortunately, we want to first build relationships at time to get to know someone. And that someone necessarily that isn't built on the premise of what we're trying to achieve, as instructional leaders, as leaders within our schools. So we find ourselves very often in a position that we have to give feedback, but then we find it difficult. And so we're only going to get into the holder backer today. All 9 take a little bit of time, but I'm going to just quickly go through them because they all speak to us in some form or fashion. So the holder backer, and let us know in the chat if this resonates with you at all. There's a time where you have to say something, and you just don't find necessarily the courage to say it. This is not self-restraint. Let's not confuse the two. There is no doubt that there are times that you have to hold back. We're discussing here, it's a time you have to say something, but sometimes to preserve the relationship or preserve, really your own mindfulness at the time. You just don't say it. It might be a Friday, 2:00, you're tired. As Vince Lombardi says, fatigue makes a coward out of us all. So we could easily fall into this trap. And so we just don't say it. The problem is progress is halted. Another one is the ambiguous. This is where the individual goes through, and they're just vague. You know, it's kind of like running on a treadmill. You're exhausted, but you haven't gone anywhere. And you're just afraid really to attack the real issue, because sometimes you have to be direct, and that directness may sting. The excuser. The excuser really right now is an easy one to fall into. And just let me say thank you, Liz. I appreciate the chat. So we know things are tough, and we want to make excuses. But what we don't want is at times to excuse behavior when it's at the expense of our students. And that's what we're referring to here. The generalist is the cousin of the ambiguous. The generalist is actually someone who is not taking the time to hone their own skills, to take deep dives into what instructional prowess is. And so they just remain everything at a general level. This is exhausting. It usually also allows a person listening to lose faith in you as a leader, because they begin to see a little bit of chink in the armor and recognize that you can't even speak to the heart of the matter. Now, this next one, this is good and bad. There are times, don't get me wrong, that you have to smooth over a situation. But the smoother over in this context is always doing it just to get by. You know, we'll be fine. We just don't want to rock the boat. We're going to smooth over these situations. The problem like this is a pebble in our shoe. It eventually leads to severe blisters when we do not take care of it. The opposer is that draconian leader that puts up walls right away. Somebody has a good idea, they oppose it for whatever reason. Maybe they're not interested in the hard work it takes to really lead, but they oppose even the best of ideas and start there. And then after a while, people get used to it. And as a culture, the entire culture starts to suffer. People are less collaborative. And as a result, ideas are thwarted, progress is halted, and again, students suffer. The osmosis, this is the person who expects, just that one email, somebody gets it. That we don't give the proper feedback. We don't give details. We don't dig into Doug Lemov's work and say, here's great instructional practices, or this is what Follin says on something. TJ mentioned the easer inner. Everybody has a little bit of the easer inner in them. We often hear also, give them a compliment feedback sandwich. Start off with something good, hit them with the feedback if it's growth-oriented feedback, and then end with something good. I can tell you in our experience, we find that not to be effective, not to be successful. The message is misinterpreted too often. They may hear the praise and not the corrective action. Or you lose trust. You just wasted 10 minutes of their time talking about something irrelevant when you should have got right into it. And then the last is the avoider. The avoider is that individual that simply really does anything to not dig into those situations. If you ever saw the movie Teacher, Teacher with Ralph Macchio years ago in the 80s, all chaos is breaking out in the lobby and the principal's underneath their desk just waiting for it to go away. That's the avoider, the one who finds the most opportune moments to go down to the nurse's office and check how's it going, and nobody's in there. Halls are passing, kids are in the halls, and etc. So these are our cancellations. We find ourselves in these boats and at times really thwarting any potential feedback of growth. TJ, you want to dig further into the holder backer?
Sure thing. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the holder backer as our first candor cancellation. And we spell these out in the book for readers and the reasons why they happen, which we're going to talk a little bit about. And they're natural. And this are things that if we can recognize in ourselves, we can help and get better as leaders. And that's part of the point too about trust is getting better. And so the holder backer is someone who thinks something but who doesn't say it for a variety of reasons. This is the epitome of nice, right? You think something in your culture, in your school, in a classroom that needs to change, but you don't say it. And that's back to the assumption that by not saying it, we'll build a relationship, we'll be nice, and then one day we'll be able to say it. But the problem with that is it's actually feels condescending, and it's horrible to find out that somebody's been thinking something for a while, especially about your practice and about your performance, and doesn't say it. And that's why our candor cancellations, not only do they cancel feedback and progress, but they hinder trust and a positive culture in a school. So the holder backer doesn't say what they think. And so we have a scenario here, and just in case you can't see it, I'll read it. Mrs. Lewis knew that the reading strategy she observed was ineffective. So Mrs. Lewis is in the classroom. She sees an ineffective reading strategy, and instead of giving the direct feedback needed for change, she asks a question. And this we've seen all the time. Mrs. Lewis is trying to bait the person into thinking what she thinks, or baiting into a realization that they did something wrong. And that's not a good strategy, and that's where we inject the candor. She held back her thoughts, and she canceled the candid conversation that she needed to have. It's far better to be assertive with direct feedback than the passive aggressive questioning that we sometimes use, especially when you do have something to say and a replacement strategy for the feedback for the teacher. Another one of our assumptions is that people know what to do and they're just not doing it. That's not true. We have to assume that someone would have done something better, like a different reading strategy, if they knew how. And so the direct and candid feedback is actually supportive of the teacher and her giving a better lesson and a better opportunity for students. And that's why it's imperative to get to that space of integrity. Joe, you want to talk about the reasons why we fall prey to these problems?
Thank you, TJ. You know, it's funny because we often find ourselves in this circle of nice. And I added a question in there. What are some scenarios where you found yourself holding back? I can share with you very often when we initiate some level of change, this is where we will find ourselves often in one of the candor cancellations, where we are, whether it's easing into a conversation, whether it's avoiding, or in this case, holding back, we often want to find reasons. Excuse me. I've been fine all day. My allergies are kicking up. Forgive me. So why are we susceptible to these traps? We said it earlier. In our profession, you know, we've entered into this profession because we want to help people. And even when we initiate a new change and we want to start something, we often want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We want to work with them. We want to support them. But there comes a matter of time where we have to start moving towards a level of accountability to make sure what we're doing is effective. The change is effective. All the PD that you're learning today, yesterday, is going to be used to some degree. So we find ourselves susceptible because, one, we're afraid of how to look. You know, TJ's the hammer. You know, he's mean. You know, that's a big deal for some of us. You know, when I first became an administrator, I was loved by kids. I ran the weight room. I wanted to become an administrator, and all I did was discipline. You go from being a heralded figure and loved to someone who's now is just issuing discipline nonstop. And so even when we find ourselves in a position where we need to give our teachers feedback, that public perception can really start to hold us back, that they're not willing to work with people, that they're just out to get teachers. And public perception can be a big, big reason why we get caught in this trap. One, we're afraid that we're going to diminish morale. Finding great educators is tough. Since 1976, there's been a decline of people coming into our industry. It's getting worse. I saw a statistic just the other day that 29% of the current workforce will continue to decline after COVID. Another is limited training. One thing we try to offer, especially in our master class and like today, is how competent do you feel? Now, I never took a course on feedback in my undergrad, master's, or my doctorate. I've never had a feedback class. I've never had a communication class. Communication was more around crisis and communicating with, your stakeholders, not necessarily having a knee-to-knee tough conversation. And it's tough. Conflict avoidance. Sometimes it's just one of those days. We don't want to enter in a ring. We have a flight or fight mechanism built into us. And lastly, and this one is true for me, number 5 is big for me. I don't want to hurt people's feelings. It wasn't until that I saw myself as a specialist and that I no longer had the right to withhold information. And I started thinking to myself, if I was a doctor and I had a patient, me withholding back information from them that could effectively make that person better. And so I started taking just a totally different viewpoint on my responsibility on providing feedback to individuals. So we have anecdotes. These anecdotes help us. And I'm going to turn it over to TJ. TJ, were you able to read Denise's chat?
Yeah, I was going to address that before we move on. So why don't I address that comment, and then you can do AFA, and then we'll get into specific praise, which I'm using that as kind of a bit of a preview to say Denise is correct. I'm going to comment on a few things that she says in there. The first is, when we build our models that we train leaders on and we use in our own districts, we put feedback into 3 buckets: specific praise, corrective action, and professional dialogue. All 3 require candor. So we're going to talk about specific praise here in a minute. Actually, the research, and we've drawn on that from places like the carrot principle, is that we're not doing a good enough job with being candid with our praise in specificity and rationale. We'll get into that with a model here in a minute. The second bucket is that corrective action. That's where we see something that we want somebody to tweak or we want them to replace. That was what happened with Mrs. Lewis. She saw a poorly delivered reading strategy, and she needed to ask the teacher to replace that with one that was effective. The assumption there is that the teacher would have replaced that strategy if they knew how or what to replace it with. The third bucket is that professional dialogue, and this is where Denise is correct, but we need to be careful with professional dialogue. Professional dialogue should be something that we didn't see or thinking that we want to explore with the teacher. That's perfectly fine to ask questions. The problem is, in some even training models, we're trained to ask teachers questions to get them to reflect, to understand something that they did wrong. The problem with that assumption is twofold. One, it assumes that we're good enough at questioning to get people to reflect metacognitively to understand something that they could have done better. And that is not likely the case with what Joe was saying with training. And number 2 is that we assume that the teacher's going to come to a conclusion that they hadn't already, meaning they know of a research-based best reading strategy that they should have used and didn't. It's not a good assumption. So we reserve professional dialogue, even for coaches and administrators. We reserve that professional dialogue for what we didn't see because of the limitations of observations and walkthroughs and being in classrooms, and not being a snapshot of what the teacher does and is. That's not fair if you're there for one day or even one visit for 15 minutes. So there's things we don't see, and there's also things that teachers think when they're planning, and those are great places to ask questions to get people to reflect. When we think something that needs to change, we should put that in a bucket for corrective action. when we think something that we want to know and reflect on and see what the teacher's thinking and possibly come to an understanding that we don't currently have, that's the place to use professional dialogue. We will say, though, what we've seen when we push into systems is that there are training models where people are using questioning to kind of lure and bait teachers. What we find there, though, is effective strategies aren't coming out on the other end of that. And we tend to use that questioning, and we get stuck in a culture or a circle of nice, because we want to question people instead of asking them to do something differently. So it's a great point, and questioning is a clear feedback strategy. We just need to be very focused on the way we use it. But great point, Dr. Donahue. Thank you.
And TJ, if I would add, Dr. Donahue, I put in a study by the Wallace Foundation on the effectiveness of principals. And in your case, if that type of dialogue is more common with the instructional coach, you would use what we're describing with those instructional coaches. So how are you making sure you're not falling into these traps with those having the direct conversation with those in the classroom? And how do you know the level of authenticity with the conversations they're having? So I threw that in there. That's a great study, and there's tons of them by the Wallace Foundation. But page 54 and on, you'll find some very specific research around communication, feedback, and the principalship. TJ, you want to get into the anecdotes?
Sure. So three of the anecdotes that we like to talk about in terms of leaders can't hold back, and where we can use our candor linked to something that is not ambiguous, that is not general, and that is fair to teachers because it's upfront. So the first is anchor, the second is focus, and the third is align. So when we're giving feedback, we can use these as tools, so to speak. So we're anchoring everything in the vision or the mission. We're referring back to what we've already set as our vision. We've seen principles with pillars of success or vision statements or core values. When we're giving people feedback, we should anchor that feedback in our core values and our pre-established vision for our learners. Second is that focus on a continual improvement. If our school really is focused on incremental improvement, professional learning for everybody, and what is working, the bright spots, we can focus on that to say, we just had this professional learning experience last week, and you did a great job with introducing the training in your classroom by using an effective strategy today. I really believe that this was something that is going to improve student learning. I want to thank you for everything that you're doing and trying to put professional learning into practice right away. We anchor that back in that continual improvement. And finally is alignment to our goals as a school. And so any goal that we set as a school for kids or for teachers, we can then align that back for our feedback. So we tell leaders that they should anchor, focus, and align. You don't have to do all three at once. It's just a great place that our feedback is not a surprise. We're focused on something and we're coming around helping people with it. Joe, you want me to
continue with the 4-part model?
Sure thing. So this is our first model that we review with leaders in the masterclass, and it's something that we teach in all of our professional development that's focused on feedback. And again, there's 3 buckets of the way feedback works: specific praise, corrective action, and professional dialogue. And actually, the research demonstrates that the leaders think they're giving praise, and the receivers of praise never feel like they're getting it. And part of that is the heart of praise, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But what we praise, we should always praise for effort or excellence, not ability. And this is really important about the teacher's thinking and the receiver's thinking about the praise. We can praise something that's not 100% excellent if the teacher's trying something new, taking a risk, putting in an effort, right? That's a really important thing for our culture. But everything else should be precision. So we want to praise the teacher for using precise strategies. So why do we praise? Praise works like this. We are in our research on praise, we looked at the psychological benefits of praise. Actually, praise hits some sensors in your brain that are similar to some other pleasure sensors. And so the two things that praise does well when it's used effectively is it instills pride in the work that we're doing, and it prompts us to want to replicate that again or repeat it. So that's a very important reason why we would praise a student or a teacher. And again, these strategies, they work with all humans, but specifically in schools, we're talking about feedback to teachers and to teacher leaders, and even during professional learning communities. So Joe, the way we typically describe it is the four parts are a praise statement. This is complimentary language, like I want to compliment you, or I want to thank you for using a collaborative structure today. Then specificity, what exactly did they do? I saw you get kids out into numbered heads, and you gave them very specific roles to make sure that everybody was going to talk. Then your rationale, why was it so important? That's so important for our learners because when the learners talk, they're more likely to learn. When they summarize, we know that they remember better. That's the cognitive science that we learned in our recent PD. Now you can hear where I'm using my AFA. And then the praise statement. Way to go today. Excellent job. And so we sandwich it with the complimentary language so that people really do hear our praise. And we give that specificity and that rationale in the center. And what happens in organizations that we find is if we give the people a way to go or you're doing a great job, they don't know what they're doing a great job with. And so the candor actually is the specificity and the rationale, and that's what creates the repetition. The praise statement that sandwiches it is the thing that creates the pride for the person and the work that they're doing in the organization. So Joe, we have a model to remember. Power specific praise.
I was putting a poll together, TJ.
Great.
So with the specific model, and the reason we start with praise is very often this is easier to praise people, but we've also found that it's not necessarily something people do that often. Interestingly enough, there's enough studies both in the private and public sectors, both in education and in industry, where very often teachers don't receive or workers don't receive very specific praise. You know, they may get like an attaboy or job well done, but what we're referring to is digging into those specifics that reinforce what you're looking to achieve within your school or your area. And that's of critical importance. So one, that's the individual feel valued. It reinforces the expectations you have, and then ultimately it's creating a positive relationship in the individual, knowing that if they're doing good work, it's recognized. And the number one reason people leave their job is their direct supervisor. I mean, it's a startling data point, but it's one of reality that we all have to sit back and think about what type of environment are we creating for those that we lead. And so specific praise is one of those that we want people to use and use often, especially as it's tied to areas of focus. So, you know, I'm not sure everyone's exact school situation and school scenario. TJ and I are both in districts that we have a hybrid model right now where students are in person and they're remote based on their choice. And so we each are about 50-50, with some that are remote, some are in person. But we all also have programs, like, so maybe at the elementary level that we want our teachers using Seesaw and creating meaningful engagement among our teachers. And so how well are we using that? And are we consciously going in and out of classrooms, either in person or remote, online, and seeing how well they're using tools that we want them to use and we want them support. So you make a praise statement. I noticed that you are, and you begin with that statement. Be very specific on what you acknowledge that you've seen, the interaction that the teacher created, the effective use of the technology. Provide a rationale. This reinforces the overall focus or the rationale behind using a tool like a formative assessment tool and why that's powerful, why that's necessary, why we have to do check for understandings throughout a lesson. So you provide that rationale, and then you double down on the praise statement and you reaffirm what they're doing. And that can just be done with a thank you for. And it seems, redundant to begin and end, but those are the bookends that really drive home what you're looking to achieve. And here's the power of this too. When we get this specific, that goes back with that anchoring and focus. Now we're driving home again our initiative, what we're looking to reinforce, and it's easier for us to provide feedback. And this we're really fortunate to be here today to present to you, and we don't have time to go into it. The antithesis for this, what we refer to as corrective action, and it doesn't have to be formal, but it's a corrective statement. We also use a similar model in which we really start to begin honing in on what we would like to see different. So you heard that now from TJ, you've heard that from me, and we would like to open it up if there's any questions. We have a couple minutes left.
Drop a question in the chat. And then, like we said, we really appreciate being here today. There's 2 other parts of the model and 9 candor cancellations and the reasons for those, and really a lot of research on how feedback and candor work that went into the book. And here's our contact information. You can certainly message us if you'd like to dig in more to this. We have a masterclass beginning on April 1st, but we also have blog content, podcasts, video blogs, always on the topic of leadership, books to read that blast out from the Schoolhouse 302. You can find us there. And again, like Joe said, we're willing to take some questions in the chat if folks have some specific questions, and we really appreciate being here, and we hope you enjoyed your conference. Joe, anything else?
No, not on my end, TJ.
And I also got a message that the masterclass is located in the booth, and you can get it for 50% cheaper than the website. So check that out in your booth at the principal seminar. And again, that starts April 1st, and it goes over all the candor cancellations and all of the models. And we make a promise that you'll be better at giving feedback right away with homework and practice and becoming a master in feedback. And so we appreciate it. And you can also dig in Candid and Compassionate Feedback, the book. Obviously, you can get that wherever you would get literature. And again, anybody has a question, please drop it in the chat. We'd love to dig in deeper.
Yeah, TJ, the last statement I'll say is we do have the PowerPoint loaded as a PDF, so you should be able to access that and pull that if you want access to it. All right. Looks like there's no remaining questions. Have a wonderful Friday. Take care, everyone.